Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Cansu. I'm a senior partner at Bethnal Green Ventures, where I lead our fundraising. Very happy to welcome you to today's session about the future of tech for good, the trends both from the founder's perspective and the investor's perspective alike. You're here, so I'm going to assume that at least some of you know who we are and what we do, but for those of you who might not be in the know, at BGV, we are Europe's leading early stage tech for good VC. Since 2012, we invest for a better society, a sustainable planet, and healthy lives. And I guess with the impact space growing bigger and bigger, we like to talk specifically about tech for good, which for us mean tech and tech-enabled products and services that are built by design to be inclusive and affordable, with an intention to positively impact millions of lives while generating great returns for us, their investors. One of our principles at BGV is be part of something bigger. And with that in mind, we always try to be as transparent as possible, whether through our blogs or articles or our impact reports that we publish every year. And as part of that, we try and learn our sharings with the wider investment community. So with that in mind, we want to talk about what we think is the future of tech for good. What does it mean for us investors, for founders, BGV portfolio and non-BGV portfolio? What are the practicalities of investing into tech for good? What are the do's and don'ts? So we'll try and go discuss these in depth in the next 90 minutes or so. So the flow of the event is, first of all, my colleague Paul will be joining us, one of our managing partners, to talk about the tech for good trends for the next 5 to 10 years and beyond. Then I'll be talking to 3 of our brilliant portfolio founders, Dr. Elin Haf Davies from Aparito, Charlie Guy from LettUs and Nat Whalley from Organise, where we will try and get their view on their respective industries and also their view of impact VCs. And finally, my colleagues, Melanie, our managing partner, and Steven Clarke, an experienced VC and an independent member of our investment committee, will be discussing the ins and outs of investing into tech for good businesses. So a little bit of housekeeping. Please put your questions in chat. My colleague Millie is the mastermind behind the scenes, and she'll make sure that we try and cover the questions either on chat or, if possible, verbally. And this is a recorded event, and we will be sharing the recording with our attendees post-event. So without further ado, I will leave it to Paul to kick today's event off. Thank you, Paul. Off to you.
Thanks so much, Cansu, and thank you everybody for joining us today. It's really good to connect with you. So one of the advantages we have at BGV is that we invest into very early stage businesses, typically at a kind of prototype stage. So when we open our call for applications, which is at the moment every 6 months, we see the very beginning of the pipeline of the future of tech for good. We see the businesses that might be really big businesses in 5 to 10 years time, just when they're at a kernel of an idea. And the good news is, looking at our what's coming in, there's no shortage of brilliant founders setting out to build high growth startups. We're in the midst of selecting our next cohort of ventures at the moment. We had well over 200 applications, and I think the sense in the team is that the quality of the teams we interviewed recently was higher than ever. So the fire hose of positivity and optimism is still firmly on in tech for good. But if the quantity and quality is going up, what else are we seeing? So over time, we see subtle changes, I think, in that pipeline, the types of ventures that apply to us for investment. In the next few minutes, I just want to share some of the things we're seeing in 2022 that we think will continue over the next few years. And there's 5 trends that I'm going to talk to you about. So the first trend is data as a tool in the climate emergency. 5 years ago, around 1 in 5 applications to BGV had climate or sustainability at its heart. More recently, that's 1 in 3. So the number of applications we're seeing that are trying to focus on tackling the climate emergency is going up. And I think it's data that is really driving a lot of those applications. I'd liken it a bit to the growth we saw in health tech companies about 5 years ago, when you had things like, new health sensors built into phones and watches and other devices that led to a real growth in health tech startups and health tech investing as well. And now we're seeing some really mature businesses in that space, but 5 years ago that wasn't the case. In the case of environmental data, I put it down to sensors, satellites, and David Attenborough, to be honest. I think, there's environmental sensors, while not in all of our phones yet, are becoming more available and more affordable and more prevalent. And satellites are now able to give us more data from imagery that shows the effects of climate change than we've ever had before, at a level that was only open to the military previously. And thanks to David Attenborough, Greta Thunberg, public awareness of environmental issues is so much higher now than it was even a few years ago. And when you start to look into the opportunity around using data to tackle the climate emergency, you realize actually the reason why this is an opportunity is that the data has been pretty terrible. It's really hard actually to estimate emissions due to activities or due to particular companies. And so I think we're seeing some good businesses really wanting to build on that opportunity. And add to that the fact that we know very little about what the effects of climate change are going to be in the future. And there's more opportunities around that because present day decisions that could be billions, sometimes potentially have impact on trillions of dollars of investment, are being made on very poor data about the future climate. And I think there's an opportunity for startups to use technology to try and predict the future better. And we're seeing more and more applications around that. So I think some of the large companies of the future will be data providers and companies that help us to change our behavior in relation to the climate emergency, and they will be big businesses in the future. The second trend is what people have started to call Web3 for good. So that's the crypto world. And I've written before that actually in the past, the crypto worlds and the tech for good worlds haven't really got on. There hasn't been much of an overlap. Apologies. But I think this year and going forward, we're starting to see that change. And I think that there's a few reasons for that. One is that crypto has started to grow up a bit. It's beyond just the early adopters now. And that makes a difference because it means people understand it enough to be able to understand what it might mean or what a particular idea might mean. And also, I think the crypto believers have gone beyond just the idea of crypto as a store of value. They're starting to think about real world applications of it. So it's not just a virtual thing, it's actually got impact on the real world, which is obviously where we come in at BGV. That's what we're really interested in. And our hunch is that Web3 might be able to deliver in areas where delivering a positive or social environmental impact is held back at the moment by bureaucracy, administrative burdens, and that kind of thing. And we think those are the areas that could be improved by Web3. But I don't take it lightly. I think there are real risks from Web3 as well. I mean, we talk about the emissions of crypto itself, from mining, but also it could just reinforce existing inequalities in the world, and we need to be mindful of that. But overall, we're pretty positive about Web3 and its potential. We saw a lot more interesting applications in our most recent call for applications. The next trend is the race to certify. Now, I think gaining external validation as a true tech for good business is starting to become more important. I think great founders are realizing that you can't just say you're an impact company, you have to prove it in order to stand out from the ever-increasing crowd. This is in part because people are wary of impact being a fad, being a bandwagon that people are jumping on, and those who call themselves impact businesses might have bad things going on. It might just be a cover for some shady dealings, to be honest. We've all got Theranos trial fairly in recent people's minds, and one of the tells I think there looking back was that everything wasn't as the founders said it was that there was a lack of any independent verification of the impact that they were claiming. And I'll single out B Corp certification as something that we're definitely seeing one of the most popular ways to try and get external independent valuation of being a force for good as a business. We were the first VC firm in the UK to certify as a B Corp back in 2015. But we've seen interest in our portfolio really grow around the B Corp certification. Fairphone was the first of our portfolio companies to certify as a B Corp. They actually did it a little bit before us, but we'll keep that to ourselves. But now we're seeing a large group of our portfolio either applying for B Corp status and in the process, or actually certifying. And I think that's a really good thing, really good trend that we hope will continue. The next trend is culture as strategy, which we previewed a little bit in our Practical Optimist newsletter a couple of weeks ago. It's the management guru Peter Drucker who described, he said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So it almost doesn't matter what your strategy is, unless you've got the company culture to back that up, to deliver it, then that strategy is almost worthless. And a trend that we're starting to see is the founders in our portfolio, founders coming to us, really taking company culture seriously. And I think Tech for Good businesses are right at the vanguard of this, and we're seeing it happen in other businesses as well, but Tech for Good businesses are really pushing the boundaries here. What do we mean by company culture? Well, it's just taking seriously the combination of policies, processes, rituals, all the touch points that you have as a business with your employees, with your stakeholders, and making sure that those are a positive experience. So a positive culture is that all of those things come together to be something that's greater than the sum of their parts. And our experience is that companies that have impact at the heart of their business model tend to take this more seriously, tend to be more mindful of this anyway. But it really hits home when you're talking about hiring. So as high growth startups, that's one of the most challenging aspects of being a Tech for Good business, is that you've got to hire well. And having a strong company culture, strong positive company culture that's reflected outside the company as well, that people know about, that people understand, whether that's through Glassdoor ratings or just word of mouth, is becoming increasingly important as employees choose where they put their working hours much more carefully, potentially, than they used to, in terms of whether it aligns with their values and what they want out of the job. And also, it turns out a positive culture is very difficult to copy, which is also, I think, why smart founders are understanding it. Actually, there's a lot of tech businesses that, on paper anyway, you could copy relatively easily, but it's very hard to copy a company culture. Once you've got it, once you've got a positive culture, and once you continue to reinforce it, it's very hard for your competitors or even large businesses to try and mimic that. It's a very strong competitive advantage. So finally, the final trend that I wanted to talk about is founders having more and more choice as to which investors they go to. Now, we're seeing more investors coming into the Tech for Good space. Some of this, in part, I think, is due to some macro trends, as more capital is being allocated to private investment, to private markets. But it's coming into Tech for Good in three ways. So first, there's new impact funds run by specialist impact managers. We see several of those, I think, over the last year. They've coming on stream pretty quickly at the moment. And that's great. We think that is brilliant to see so many more new impact funds being raised. The second sort is impact funds from established, more generalist venture capital investors. So that might be a fund that's specifically targeting climate change, for example, and we're seeing more of that as well. And then finally, you're getting generalist VC funds that are actually looking at Tech for Good businesses because essentially they've realized they're great businesses, and that's brilliant as well. But the sum of this, including, I think, a growth in interest in angel investing and as well, is that there is more capital and more choice for Tech for Good founders than there ever has been. It's not to say that there aren't founders who are being overlooked, though. And I think there's still a danger that the same people that were overlooked in the past for investment are overlooked in the current system. And so it's super important, I think, that we continue the battle for diversity and inclusion in the VC industry, something that we take super seriously at BGV. What I think it means, though, is that Tech for Good founders do have more choice than they ever had. For us as BGV, that means more competition, but we honestly think that's a jolly good thing. It means that okay, we've been doing this for longer than most, but we've got to be on our A game all the time. We've got to be proving that we bring extra value to founders over and above everybody else around us. And that's something that we take very, very seriously. So there you go. There's 5 trends that we're seeing at Bethnal Green Ventures. I hope they got you thinking. If you have others, then that you think we should know about, then please do get in touch. You're always welcome to drop me an email. I'm paul@bethnalgreenventures.com. Always happy to hear from investors who'd like to connect. With that, I will hand you back over to Chansu, and you'll hear next from some of our exciting portfolio founders.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for sharing your view on the trends. So I will now ask Dr. Elin Haf Davies to join me here. Hi, Elin. Lovely to see you here. She's the founder and CEO of Aparito, who are revolutionizing clinical trials. But I'll let her tell you how. Elin, if you could give us an introduction on Aparito.
Thank you so much. So yes, nice to meet you all. I'm Elin Haf Davies. I'm the founder and the CEO of Aparito, digital health medtech, primarily based in Wales. We were part of the BGV alumni 7 years ago. And as Paul mentioned, back then we had, I think, 7 slides on a PowerPoint of ideas of how we wanted to change the clinical trial landscape. My background as a children's nurse in academia, and then later as a regulator. And so while Aparito is only 7 years, I think the concepts and the learning from my clinical, academic and regulatory background contributes quite heavily to what we're aiming to do in Aparito. And it's all centered around our software platform called Atom5, which has 5 pillars to engage patients with their clinicians and the sponsor during a clinical trial. Now, historically and traditionally, patients would require quite considerable travel distance to specialist centres at quite frequent interval, very often just to complete paper-based questionnaires or to do some standardized assessments that were very much influenced by stress, fatigue, and those kind of aspects that's intertwined with visiting a hospital on a regular basis. And what we wanted to do was to allow patients to take part in clinical trials from the comfort of their own home. And when you're supporting children or people living with an extremely rare disease, this is even more important. As mentioned, I started Aparito 7 years ago, which was BC, or before COVID as I know it. And before COVID, it was actually incredibly hard to change the cultural mindset that patients could be safely assessed for clinical trials in the home setting. And while there's not many good things about COVID, the one thing I would say is that it has changed this sort of cultural inertia that it can be done and that it should be done. Now, not every clinical trial is suitable for at-home recruitment, monitoring and assessment, but certainly most clinical trial can enable a hybrid approach where we look to reduce the number of visits required to a hospital and the frequency or the duration of the time that they're spending in hospital. And that's through using a software platform for capturing patient-reported outcome, medication adherence. And what we're seeing a lot of recently is standardized video-based assessments and wearable data. So the combination of video and wearable allows for new insights to measure what's important for the patients in the comfort of their home. So I think I'll pause there and hand over back to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this intro. So just as a reminder for the audience, if you have any questions about Aparito in particular or the sector, please put them in chat and I will try and incorporate. Otherwise, I have a few of my own to ask Elin. So Elin, as you mentioned, with COVID, we've seen the acceleration of transformation to remote and digital. And can you talk about like the overall implications for that for your own industry and like how that contributed to how Aparito was viewed or your growth, etc.?
Yes, I think there's two main kind of influences, if you like. One is the regulatory compliance. So working in the clinical trial space, as you can imagine, it's very, very highly regulated. And so it should be, but sometimes navigating those compliance and regulatory obstacle can take quite some undertaking when you're supporting patients globally. So most of our studies have got global recruitment of patients, which means that we need to be mindful of global regulatory compliance implications. And that takes a lot of sort of navigating in that regard, and a lot of accreditation and certificates to demonstrate that we work within certain sort of frameworks. But I always find these regulatory guidance to be a value add, and often not one to sort of see as a problem. The second big driver, I think, is patient centricity. Now, over the last sort of 10, 15 years, we've heard a lot of words such as patient involvement, patient engagement, patient centricity. And I think in the clinical trial space, it had been, if I'm honest, a bit of a tokenism. So sponsors would design the most horrific clinical trial that would just be really challenging for any patient to take part in, but they would ask a patient to write a lay language summary of the information sheet, as if that was some way of saying, well, you know, we got a patient to write all about it, not accounting for the fact that the design itself was really not patient-centric at all. So I think there's a move now that people are really buying into patient centricity. And from our part, we've launched our patient group accelerator. And with the patient group accelerator, we work with patient groups to identify firstly what's important to them and why they want to measure that in terms of an impact on their quality of life. And then we look at digital innovative ways of measuring that at home, away from the hospital.
I see. Thank you for that. And I guess, I mean, we have a widely investor audience for this event, and we wanted to sort of get the founders' view on their interactions with them, and perhaps, you know, some sort of perhaps things that you wish the investors that you speak to knew about either your space or about investing in founders in general. Are there any nuggets of wisdom you want to share with us?
Yeah, I guess there's quite a few. You know, I remember when I first ventured into, you know, I was a complete civil servant, right? I was a nurse, I was an academic, and I was a regulator. So I had never worked in an industry, commercial, corporate sector at all. And therefore it was a real culture shock, or sort of quite a traumatic experience for me all of a sudden to be looking towards seeking investment and having to understand how to get investment. And that, you know, I would say 6, 7 years ago, it was actually quite hard to get social impact investors, and majority of my conversation were with more traditional investors. And I still have quite a few scars from quite a few emotional conversations when actually they didn't really want to know about our patient centricity approach or our view on compliance. They just wanted to know what our valuation and, you know, kind of financial metrics were, which was obviously quite difficult. But for me, I would say appreciate the nuance of the sector that you're going to. I think healthcare is a particularly challenging, nuanced one to navigate, in the fact that it's not a tech space where you can, you know, break things quickly and sort of iterate quickly. But also, you know, I guess if you're investing in the founder, you're investing in the fact that they do have that sector specific knowledge or that network around them to make good decisions, and sort of be able to support that, really would be the two specifics from my point.
Thank you. And like so talking about investor again, we like to throw out the word value add quite a lot. And can you think of any examples of value add beyond capital that you've seen in your investors?
Yeah, I think I joke that we either like to have silent or smart investors, and the smart investors, of course, are the ones that can bring in network, so widen the network to make introductions, and to sort of bring in a critical friend sort of aspect, but in a way that's not distracting from time and energy and emotion. So a bit of a helpful cheer, but also a widening network to make important introductions, either be that for new clients, new investors, or just general network is always really helpful.
Okay, and like the final question I have is like, I know that you're an advocate for women in leadership, and like, how does that how has your experience been when you think about that and the overall investment ecosystem, or your conversations with investors?
Yeah, I honestly say that my most horrific conversation with investors have been when I've been the only woman in the room and faced with sort of a table full of slightly older white men. I think it's really important to note, or interesting to note, that all our investments in Aparito has been with either institutional organizations or individuals that have got women involved. So the initial person in all our institutional investors had a woman on the table, on the other side of the table. And I definitely advocate that has enabled us to sort of move forward with investments with those organizations, and that we need to not only promote female founders, but we need to promote the presence of women on the investors side of the table too, so that there's a bit more balanced view and discussion of the world.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, but I would say that. And I guess I said last, but I actually have one more question. I know that you built this business in Wales, and it's proudly HQ'd in Wales. Has that played into your conversations with what I would assume are more mainstream VCs, like you choosing to operate Aparito from there?
Yeah, I mean, we joke quite regularly about it, but if you're a male founder and working within the Cambridge, the golden triangle of Cambridge, Oxford, London, that's where the investment seems to flow, right? The golden triangle and sort of male founders operating in that space. For me, Development Bank of Wales have a focus on life science, on technology and renewable, and about building economic growth in Wales. So they were a good fit for me. They had a female investment manager at the time that I started my negotiations with them. So they ticked a lot of those important boxes there. And in terms of, costs of office space and that kind of thing, although it's not so applicable now, I guess, but it's you're not fighting for the same talent pool within the golden triangle.
I see. Thank you so much for making time for us today, Elin. It was great to hear from you, and hope to see you in person soon.
Thank you for having me.
Can I now ask Charlie to please come on stage, i.e. turn your video. Hi.
Hi there, Jancy.
Hi, well, welcome. Thanks for joining us. So I'm here with Charlie, the co-founder and CEO of LettUs Grow, who's helping solve the food insecurity through advanced aeroponics, based in Bristol. Charlie, can you tell us about LettUs Grow?
Yeah, of course. And yeah, pleasure to be here today. And yeah, looking forward to answering any questions that come from the audience. Apologies if there's any noise. We've got lunch going on here, so it's a bit rowdy outside my window. I'm going to take you on a slightly different tack from Elin. We're one of those earlier climate-focused companies that BGV backed all the way back in 2017 now, who I guess Paul referenced in his initial sort of trends of those climate-focused companies increasing over the last few years in terms of BGV cohorts. So at LettUs Grow, we've developed a method that enables us to effectively grow plants much faster than traditional technologies, thus enabling us to grow more efficiently with less resource impacts and in a more sustainable way. We founded the company back in 2015-16 with the mission to reduce the waste and carbon footprint of fresh produce. And that's what we've been working on over the last 5 or so years. The, I guess, core of this is we use a number of novel techniques that mainly focus on growing indoors, where we are protecting crops from the environment, which is obviously, as we know, becoming less and less stable for traditional agricultural methods. And really we're focused on a more circular use of inputs and reusing inputs and looking at growing crops in a much more with circular economy principles. We grow in both vertical farms, which I expect those of you who are more in tune with sort of climate tech investments will have been aware of been some pretty substantial raises over the last 5 or so years. But also we work in the much more developed and mature greenhouse industry, which we believe has a huge role to play in the future of our food production in a sustainable way. In terms of what we do specifically, the uniqueness of LettUs Grow's technology is focused on something called aeroponics. This is a technology which was first pioneered by NASA, but we've developed a new advanced way of doing this, which effectively mimics the perfect soil environment, where we're able to spray the plant roots with a very fine mist containing all of the nutrients and water that they need. This effectively gives them much greater access to oxygen, carbon dioxide, and results in them growing much faster and more efficiently. As a business, so we supply both technology and support services, including data services, into the two sort of key sectors of greenhouses and vertical farms, with the focus on advancing sustainability of both agriculture and more, I guess, more specifically the horticultural sector that provides a lot of our fresh produce. Our first products are the container farming systems. There's a picture of one behind me. They are bright pink. We make them pretty brash and obvious to make sure that we're generating conversation around our food system. And yeah, we've got 9 projects around the UK that we've delivered. Majority of those were delivered last year, that enable people to grow leafy greens, herbs in any environment around the world. The systems are sort of self-contained units. They're modular. We can drop them anywhere, and they enable us to grow without the need for pesticides, herbicides. They're powered by renewable energy and use up to 95% less water than traditional agricultural systems due to the recirculation. That's probably enough in terms of an intro. I guess, the next steps for us, we're focusing on additional deliveries of our container systems in the UK and around the world, and scaling up the actual fundamental aeroponic technology to increase our impact from the sort of smaller scale that we're operating at the moment to hectare scale agriculture.
Thank you, Charlie, for the intro. I matched the drop and grow today, as you can see.
You're on brand, Jancy.
Full the disclosure, I'm a board observer at LettUs Grow, so Charlie and I, we talk relatively more regularly than some of our portfolio funds. So when you first started LettUs Grow with the other co-founders, Ben and Jack, where do you think the sector was in general? And where do you think it has moved? Like my relatively uninformed view is, with the climate crisis becoming more and more apparent, there's more appetite into this from an investment space, but like, I'd like to hear it from you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a lot has changed in the last 5 years. The sector has grown substantially. A lot of that has been driven by VC interest, mainly in the US. There's been some really substantial deals, I think, and it's been growing year on year. That's what's causing a bit of turbocharged growth in the vertical farming sector. But obviously there's the macro trends which sit behind this. And yeah, there's the climate emergency, there's more locally to the UK, the issues with Brexit and food and sort of supply chains and food security. And then obviously the one which we saw a huge amount of I guess change in how people were talking about what we do in the food system was with COVID and the impacts that had on disrupting global supply chains. So there's been a lot that's happened in the last few years that have helped to drive that growth, alongside the sort of greater and greater appreciation from sort of public conscious of the issues within our food systems and the climate emergency.
I see. And like, what were and are some of the misconceptions you see when you're talking to investors in this space?
Yeah, I think initially, obviously, it depends on the specialism of the investors, and we tend to focus on working with those in the sort of agricultural sector and looking more broadly to those in the environmental and sort of energy sectors. But I think there's something which I guess I might touch on now is the sort of the amount of money that's come into the industry generates a lot of hype and excitement, and there's been some pretty big bold claims made over the last few years which now need to be backed up. And I think that's one area where there can be misconceptions, because some people see vertical farming as a sort of panacea, a silver bullet for our whole food system, but that's not how we see it. We see it as a tool to help increase the efficiency of farming and working with growers to do that. Whereas some people look at this and think we can replace farming, we can do this in the cities, we can do this at massive scale, and we won't need to farm in a traditional way anymore. But that's, for us, we work much closer with farmers, with growers, existing growers, to provide them with the tools to help them grow more efficiently.
Okay, so there's a question from Matthias. Thank you, Matthias. I'll just read it, which I think links back to what you just said. Well, are the contemporary thoughts around regenerative farming, often flagged recently as a desirable philosophy in sustainable farming, relevant at all to LettUs Grow's view of the future of farming?
Yeah, thanks, Matthias. And yeah, great to see you on the call. There's a massive correlation in my view of sustainable farming between regenerative agriculture and what we do, although often you'll get quite different almost belief systems around the two, but I think they marry quite nicely together. I think the important thing to notice and think about is that the way that we farm at LettUs Grow is intensive, but doesn't impact on the natural system around us. So we're able to protect the natural system by farming in an intensive way. What regenerative agriculture does is enable us to really work with natural systems and apply techniques, science to work with them. And the two go hand in hand in terms of being able to increase the sustainability of farming across the board. I think we need a multitude of approaches, in the same way that we've got a multitude of approaches within food production at the moment. But the intensive side of agriculture needs to be removed from the natural side of it to enable us to produce enough food. And that's not what happens at the moment. At the moment, we intensively farm our soils, intensively farm the natural environment, and that's what's led to soil degradation, eutrophication, a lot of the other climate-related and biodiversity-related issues from agriculture.
Okay, thank you for that, Charlie. And I guess you were talking about essentially LettUs Grow being part of a wider solution of ecosystem of solutions. How do you think the investors approach this? Like, do you think they approach this as an advantage, or do you think they think it's your success is contingent on the other chains in the system?
Yeah, I think what we've seen is a great acknowledgement in the last few years of how systems work together and how it's a complementary group of systems that we're going to need to fight climate change. I guess a really clear example is for our facilities, we absolutely mandate that they're renewable energy powered, because there's no point in using fossil fuels to power our systems. That just makes no sense. So that's one sort of additional system you can integrate, and then you've got things like waste treatment that you can integrate. You've got other resource flows, sort of biodigestion for any waste that might come out of the facility, and then you can take a much more integrated view of the different systems that go together. And I think that's the more nuanced approach that we're seeing more investors in tune with over the last few years than when we started. I think there's quite an interesting conversation to have with the investment community around how you build a portfolio of complementary technologies, because that's ultimately, if you can support numerous technologies that provide each other with benefits, then that can, that obviously helps everyone else, everyone out in that sort of group of complementary technologies. So yeah, there's definitely a thought around how portfolios are built to do that are very much focused on sort of hard circular economy technologies. And by hard, I mean physical, almost infrastructure level things like energy, like food, like waste treatment.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm sure the investors on the call are, I agree with you on particularly on the portfolio construction point. I guess talking about investors, and perhaps a question similar to what I've asked Elin around what sort of investors you prefer to have on your cap table. Like, are there any criteria when you start building your investor strategy? What sort of investors you prefer to talk to?
Yeah, I guess as I touched on earlier, it's much easier for us to have get to in-depth conversations very quickly with investors that understand the sector. So we've focused on bringing in some sector specialist investors for agri-tech, but we also, in terms of the sort of sustainability and impact side, that's the other obvious preference for us, is bringing in investors that have knowledge of other sectors that may be more developed than ours, and think about the learnings they can bring to the business from those other sectors as they've sort of developed and adoption has increased. So the main focuses for us are sustainability focused, impact focused, and ag tech and food tech.
Yeah, that makes sense. And are there any specific pieces of advice that you would love to give to our investors on this call when they want to talk to a company relatively similar to LettUs grow in the agri-tech space?
I think there's the main sort of advice I would give is to make sure that any external advisors that also brought in to look at an investment case understand the industry fully, because ag tech is so broad and it's also quite, you can get quite polarizing views, a bit like the question that Matthias posed earlier. Sometimes you'll speak to someone in ag tech in regenerative farming, and they might have very different views to someone like myself. And it's very important that any sort of external advisors, if you're not ag tech experience yourself as an investor, that they really understand the space that you're working within, because it's almost quite surprising when you start when you've been sort of working in ag tech, the sort of passion behind different systems of growing. And my view, as I said before, is we need a multitude of solutions to address the climate problem. So yeah, I'd say choose any advisors carefully on that side.
Thanks, Charlie. We have a final question for you from Jonathan, asking about your patents and patent protection you have.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. So we've got 3 patents covering our aeroponic systems. I'll just touch on this briefly. So yeah, they cover some of the core technology that we've developed in-house that enables us to produce the mist that our plant roots grow into. And then they also cover the integration into systems at different scales, all the way from the small scale containers up to very large scale automated indoor farming systems.
Thank you, Charlie. That's our time for today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Nancy. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, now I'll ask Nat to please join me on stage. Hi, Nat. Lovely to see you.
Good to see you.
So everyone, this is Nat Whalley, co-founder and CEO at Organise. Nat, do you want to talk about what Organise do and how you are the leading platform in the UK for workplace campaigning?
Sure, absolutely. So yeah, Organise, the problem, Organise, as I'm the CEO, the problem we're solving is so the future of work is changing, as lots of us know, and a lot of that has been accelerated by the pandemic. Office jobs are now living room jobs, case in point, some of the people on this call, and people are really fragmented, and then bad bosses are able to monitor your Slack, your email, and see how people are talking, which is making it really difficult to find out if the problems you're facing are shared problems or if it's just you. And really difficult for workers to be able to fix them. So that's where Organise comes in. So we're on a mission to give people the tools, the network and the confidence to make change happen in their workplace. So I'll talk briefly about sort of the 3 pillars of our mission. So the network, so if you think about something like LinkedIn or Facebook, a network that's built on top of a social graph. So it's who you know, whether that's at work or socially. So that's one kind of idea of a graph. Then you've got things like nextdoor.com that are built on a local graph. So you might not know them personally, but they live near you. What we're building is a network on top of a worker graph. So people who work in your workplace, your sector or your industry, and linking people to talk pseudonymously. So you're protected, your identity is safe, but you're able to have real discussions with people in those kind of networks. So that's the network part of our mission. Then the tools we talk about are things like petitions and surveys to be able to find out are the things you're experiencing shared, how widely are these problems shared, and then run petitions or open letters to kind of call for change, whether that's at a workplace level or a national level. And then finally, the confidence piece. So you're doing this in a community of people where you're watching people do this all the time and you're building your confidence to be able to speak up at work. It can be really scary to kind of start a petition, but if you see 3 people in sort of a similar industry do it at their workplace, you kind of build that swagger and you're like, I could do that, I can give it a go. So an example of this, just to kind of bring it to life, through the pandemic, we had a bunch of nurses who were working in the NHS. I don't know if you cast your mind back to sort of March, April 2020. We didn't know very much about the virus or like how it worked, and pregnant women were told to work from home. It probably wasn't safe to go into work. For NHS workers, particularly frontline workers, the official advice was work from home if you can. If you can't, they were being told they had to come into the office, which we thought might be super dangerous. So workers at a particular trust, so the NHS is structured into sort of 57 trusts in England, ran a survey, not just of their trust, but of trusts across the country to map the scale of the problem. So they did that through Organise, they did it anonymously, but they were mapping their trusts, so where they worked, and data about how pregnancy was being handled through that. They kind of basically built a people-powered report that they then took to the CEOs of each of the trusts. And the fascinating thing is a lot of those CEOs had no idea. They thought they had a policy whereby pregnant women were able to go home with full pay, but the reality and the lived experience of people in those trusts was that they were being told to come into work, which was super dangerous. So using that data, they basically took it to the CEOs, gave them a data point they could never have got another way because the policy said one thing, but the reality was something quite different. And then they were able to issue a mandate to make sure that all pregnant women could go home with full pay. So that's an example of Organise being used, which I'm super proud of.
Thank you, Nat. And I know that you have a plethora of examples that you should be even more proud of, but perhaps we'll come to that. So I guess you mentioned future of work, which is a term I believe investors have heard over and over again in the last 2 years. But what we see in most conversations is that when the mainstream conversation for future of work is around productivity, improving productivity, sometimes at all costs. So how do you think that played into your conversations with investors? If so, how? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think so. The thing that we really get to the heart of when we talk to an investor is like making sure that our impact and our business model are linked, and they understand that that's really important. So our impact and our business model is that we're creating a safe space paid for and protected by the workers, and therefore it's in the interest of the workers. And I think the really interesting thing in terms of productivity is it's often in the interest of the workers to fix something that's making it really hard for them to do their jobs. So like a recent example of this is at Network Rail. They basically changed the structure of how you have, like when you go and fix bits of the train track. So the drivers, they changed the way that they got their vans, and it meant it was taking them about 4 hours longer to pick up their tools, pick up their vans and get to a job. It's very easy when you're sat in head office looking at a budget line to shift some money around. I think that's a really good decision. The data point they didn't have is the kind of impact on time that would have. So it massively tanked productivity, and they have no way of seeing that. So the workers ran a survey to map that and push that back and get that shifted back to a way that they were able to be productive again. And so I think like that for us is like an example of impact and productivity being intrinsically linked. And I think similarly in terms of business model, those two also have to be linked.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess, again, this is an investor audience, so we're trying to make it useful for them hearing from you. So I'll ask you a couple of the same questions I asked the other panelists. So first of all, in terms of value add, beyond capital, what can you give us examples of some key things that you received from your investors that you deem very valuable?
Completely. So I think there's two main things. One is network. So like, you know, I didn't come from an entrepreneurial background, and being able to link up with some really impressive people in the space. So we've just closed our seed round, and it's a bunch of super angels they're all operators, they've all run very successful companies. We'd never have been connected to them and never had them invested, like, you know, literally or like emotionally, without the network we got through BGV and other investors early days. So like that network is a really important piece. And then through that, one of the other things is like advisors. So that probably is the same, it's almost network again. But like we hired our first product designer, and we worked with the guy who turned out to be Twitter's first product designer to design not just the process, but help us do some of the assessments. And he's now a mentor to our product designer. And like, there's no way we'd have got that without our investors. So like super, super thankful for those networks.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we've talked a little bit about the future of work and your proof points around, you know, sort of perhaps to counter argue against that, something that an investor might have raised. What are the other misconceptions that you see when you're having conversations with investors?
Good question. I think the biggest misconception we see, particularly, and I think this is shifting over the last few years, but this idea that like impact doesn't make as much cash as like non-impact, and I think that's naive. I think as long as the model and the impact are linked, there's like a huge potential, because impact is an intrinsic motivator. Like the value add is not just like a transaction; you're also getting something beyond that. And so I think that's the biggest misconception we see. And
so you have a number of impact investors on your cap table, but when you bring in new investors during any investment round, do you have any criteria that you look for? Like what do you care most in your investors?
I think that they understand our mission and they understand what we're trying to do. So we often talk through, this is kind of coming back to some of Elin's point, but like we have a lot of strong examples, some around sexual harassment. I often tell that story in investment meetings, mainly to gauge their reaction. Are they comfortable with some of the difficult things that Organise might unearth? But they have huge impact and huge like tangible benefits for real people, but it's quite a difficult space. And so making sure that they understand like the impact, it can be huge and it can be exciting, but it can also be a bit uncomfortable sometimes. And so we really probe and see the reaction on that one.
That's fair. We should be sweating a little during those conversations, right? And sort of trying to put it back towards the wider sector trends, like from when you first started Organise, which is 4 or 5 years ago now, I think.
I think that's in March.
And how have you seen the industry evolve? Like what do you think has changed? What has not perhaps changed?
Yeah, I think so. When we first started, I think BGV coined the term worker tech. There was hardly anyone in the space. We were definitely your first worker tech investment. And, you know, it was a completely open market. There was hardly anyone there. I think particularly probably due to the pandemic and sort of the tailwinds of that. It's now, there's a lot more people springing up, which is awesome. Particularly in the US, there's definitely quite a few sort of networks starting to be built on that sort of worker graph that we were discussing. And I think there's a lot of space for it because there's a huge number of people, and work is going through this sort of like massive like sort of century shift.
Yeah. So beyond the the transformation to digital and remote through COVID and all the other forces for a few decades, do you think there are other big drivers that make, let's call it worker tech, a more attractive investment proposition for investors?
Yeah, so I think the other thing is the counterpoint to automation. So like as jobs shift, like what does work need to look like, or what can work look like? And workers themselves have loads of great ideas on that. And I think it's basically opening up the box to see like where are these different ideas on how we can shift work in a positive direction. Mm-hmm.
Oh well, you're answering so succinctly and quickly. I'm able to go through all of my questions. Excellent. So another one is what sort of insights that you gathered from your investors that sort of surprised you, like, or was there any instance of that happening? Perhaps it didn't.
Insights, was that?
Yeah, insights, or like observations on your either product or your sector.
Yeah, so my favourite thing, so a couple of our investors are from like a gaming background. So one of them was one of the founders of Candy Crush. And they look at it through a completely different lens. So we talk a lot about network effects, so that's kind of a key driver of our business. And when they looked at the way we acquire users and how they stay with us, And looking at it through a lens of like gaming, all of a sudden you're looking at repeat users and really focusing our OKRs much more in a way that you would look at something like adoption of a game and repetitive, and like that concept of like taking collective action, which is essentially what we do, gamifying it to create more and more impact is really exciting, and something I never would have thought we'd have got from our investors. So it was like a really challenging but exciting way to think about things.
Yeah, definitely. You know, another argument for having people from different backgrounds around the table, I guess. And so thinking about a different angle, not from the investment, but perhaps recruitment angle, like when you recruit, do you see potential hires being interested in your mission? I mean, I guess, you know, I know the answer to that will be yes, but like, I guess the real question I'm trying to ask here is, do you think being an impact business makes you more competitive than a relatively similar counterpart for a potential hire?
Completely. So I think we've been quite lucky, I think, in our hires, and you kind of mentioned it at the start, like being really intentional about who you hire when you've got an impact business. But I think like we attract people who are super passionate, who are like really driven by the mission. But then the fact that we are also VC backed means that we're on similar terms to people who've taken similar levels and rounds to us. So we're able to offer like a great benefits package alongside this thing that's going to really get you out of bed in the morning. And that's a really attractive proposition. I know it's quite a difficult hiring market at the moment, but we're not seeing that because I think we're mission driven, and I think other impact businesses also get that benefit. It makes it much easier to hire the best people, and that compounds right into a better business.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess with more and more people being more vocal about their either existing impact initiatives or their, you know, desire to become more positively impactful, then it's adding to the competition, I would say. And that sort of made me think around the question around, you know, impact measurement, because if everything is positively impactful, then is everything really positively impactful? So can you tell us a little bit about how you tend to track and measure your impact, and also perhaps the way you communicate that to your investors?
Yeah, I think this is one of the trickiest challenges as an impact-focused business. You know, when we're doing our financial reporting, there's a very clear, obvious way to do our financial reporting. Everyone does it the same. I think with impact reporting, like the expectations from investors are quite disparate, and we've worked quite hard to kind of get our investors on the same page in terms of what we're measuring. We're looking, because we don't have a particular mission in the sense of like, we're not asking for this policy change. The change that happens is driven by the workers. So we're not like measuring it by a particular outcome in that sense, but what we are looking at is the confidence of the people using our platform as a key measure of impact. So are they feeling more powerful in themselves, which is often a good indicator of whether they're winning the campaigns they're running. And then also like repeat action is the other way we're looking at, are they coming back and continuing to take more? Because you wouldn't keep doing it if it wasn't working.
Yeah, and final question from me. Any pieces of advice that you would like to give to any impact or non-impact investors on the call when they are looking at your space or trying to work with founders or companies like yours?
Yeah, I think two things to look out for is like passion, like just a real passion for, because I think that bleeds through into good businesses. And secondly, that coming back to that point around like making sure that the impact that they're having and the business model work hand in hand, because that's going to compound into a significantly better business. Excellent.
Thank you so much, Nat, for joining us today, and hope to see you soon in person.
Thanks, Nancy.
Right, so we've had, like, that's a lot of information from three brilliant founders. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I'm now going to hand it over to my colleagues Melanie and Steven to talk about the practicalities of investing into tech for good ventures. If you could come on stage. Hi, Steven, just waiting for Melanie.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for making the time. Just going to check Melanie's not having any technical difficulties. We'll give Melanie a moment. Perhaps it's a good excuse for everyone to.
Looks like she's coming. There she is.
I am here, sorry.
Excellent.
I was my video was not enabled, but I'm here now, so don't worry. Apologies. I'm frantically sending you messages.
Okay. Leave it to you. Thank you both.
Perfect. Thank you, Chastity. Well, hello, and welcome to those of you who are joining Stephen and I for our conversation now. I'm Melanie Hayes. I'm one of the managing partners at BGV, and I lead our investment and portfolio team. And I'm delighted to be joined by Steven Clarke, who is the independent chair of our investment committee at BGV. And this final conversation in today's event is really an opportunity for us to explore some of the practicalities of investing in tech for good and in impact. I'm going to introduce Steven to you now. I would really love for our audience to contribute any questions you might have as we go along. We've got a few prompts, but would love to take your queries and comments into account. So, by way of introduction, Steven is the chair of BGV's investment committee. As I mentioned, he joined us about 3 years ago. He has a wealth of investment experience, spent over 21 years in the European technology investing space, including roles at 3i and August Equity, and has spent the last 9 years working as an advisor and non-exec and investor to founders, in particular scaling software and data businesses. He loves to focus on helping founders build out their teams and is a huge advocate for developing compelling go-to-market strategies. And so we're very lucky to have him as part of the BGV lineup. Steven, thank you so much for agreeing to share your perspectives with us. I've lots that I'd like to ask you about what you've learned from investing in good, but also I think in particular pick up on some of the things that's emerging on the horizon as well. So I'm going to kick off and ask you just very quickly, just tell us a little bit about in terms of the wealth of experience that you have in investment and your recent experience of investing in tech. What do you think, in your view, is the difference for investing in impact ventures from non-impact companies?
Thank you, Melanie, and welcome everyone taking part. Yes, well, from my perspective, we see a lot of the impact obviously embedded in the way BGV goes about its business. So, we focus very much on impact through the investment committee papers and the discussion. Obviously, you and your colleagues have shown a lot of commitment to this area. So, I think, if I were to contrast that with other investors who are rapidly learning about purpose and impact and trying to implement it in their portfolio companies, etc., it's a very different feel with BGV, where it really is at the sort of heart and the history of everything you've been doing, and that certainly comes through in the investment committee papers, in that the impact is not only there in terms of metrics, but is talked about openly and often comes up in terms of the conversation, in terms of how we're talking about the market they're operating in.
Thank you, Steven. And perhaps just for the benefit of our audience, could you explain a little bit about what drew you to becoming involved with not just BGV, but impact investing, because your experience is broader than just BGV. I suspect some of our audience are on a similar journey, so might be interested to hear how you came to be here.
I think there's probably two key elements to that. The people involved in your business, very much people I enjoy working with, and back 3 years ago thought that would be really interesting approach, and the way you set out the way that you structured the business and the very data-driven approach to investment really sort of helped you stand out in my mind as people who could work with, but also would learn from as well, to be clear. And in impact in terms of the portfolio too, really amazing entrepreneurs and leaders of those businesses. As an investment committee, we've met quite a few of the businesses, and that's a really good part of what we do in terms of trying to get to see them face to face, albeit Zoom these days, because you get a really great sense of what they're doing. And from my kind of broader perspective, the necessity of building purpose into businesses in the kind of global environment we're in now, but also the threat to some of the more if you like, historic existing businesses, some of whom I'm involved in, where I can see that there is, as one thing, a kind of recruitment challenge. I think Nat was just touching on it in terms of, people want to see purpose very closely aligned with the business model, and will be put off by sitting in front of employees in interviews that kind of really can't demonstrate that embedded impact.
Interesting. So your shift has in somewhat been driven by what you can see as threats to the status quo, as much as by what you see to be the benefits of something more.
Absolutely, and the difficulty of, if you like, trying to repurpose an existing business, as opposed to where BGV is starting, which is incubating businesses and helping these entrepreneurs kind of create something from scratch, where absolutely everything about the business drives and refines that purpose in all the areas, be it in the customer relationships, the broader stakeholder relationships, and the recruitment of people.
Yeah. So let's kind of, I guess, explore that thread around people a little bit more. So what in your view is different, if anything, about the management teams, whether those are founders or kind of new senior hires that join these tech for good businesses? And what's different about those teams? What do you look for when you are thinking about, as an investor, is this a backable team in this space?
That's interesting, because I think there's probably three components in most young businesses that you're looking to form fairly quickly as the business drives forward. One is around the ability to create the technology, whether it be a product or service, so that kind of technical ability. Quite a lot of founders start from a technical background. The second is their ability to find a market for it, really find that product market fit, and bring something new to the offering. And the third is to be able to sell it. All founder businesses start as a founder-led sale. Outside of the area of impact, let me step back. Ordinarily, you probably get 2 out of those 3 things in all sort of startups, in all tech startups that are funded by VCs, etc. In impact, I don't think you can forego the technical and the passion for the purpose and the finding the market and being able to describe what's different here. And so you may start off needing to bring on board at a later date more sales-led approach, whereas in a more traditional VC market, maybe you'll find someone, a founder-led team, who are very technical and very good at selling, but don't really understand their market or don't really have fit yet. I don't think you can do that in the impact area, because the necessity of delivering the purpose, of being confident about that and really thinking about how you need to influence the market is absolutely crucial to what we've seen in terms of success of BGV portfolio companies. And you've heard from Nat, etc., and Charlie just half an hour ago.
So there's something about founders having that authenticity, that commitment to purpose, to the impact they're trying to achieve, in order to then perhaps tap into some of those benefits that our founders have mentioned around recruitment, around sort of engaging and connecting with customers, in innate and detailed understanding of their market. So okay, yes, that's super interesting. And then, is there anything, I suppose, in particular that you would say kind of perhaps strikes you about the types of founders that work in these businesses? Are there any traits that you look for or would be wary of, for example, if you're evaluating a business?
Yeah, there's probably 3 elements again there, but let's start where we were just finishing off on the last question. Is really that, and again, the individuals who've already been speaking today are great exemplars of this. Is the founders of businesses with impact are going to be, or need to be, really good, what I call campaigners. What you heard earlier was people who talk very broadly about campaigning with different stakeholders. not just thinking about customers or just employees, but thinking broadly about how do we need to change this industry? How do we need to change the potential customers' outlook? How do we need to influence government policy? It's a really difficult thing to do. It's a very broad thing. But gosh, if you're good at it and you're driven by that purpose, you'll do it really, really well. As we've heard from the individuals before. So that kind of from BGV's portfolio and the investment committee, we hear about this first when you're sifting the cohort in terms of the applicants, and you're seeing, and really a lot of the conversation that comes across to us is around the strength of the individuals in being able to do that campaigning, but also then what the crux of their business model is going to be and why it may work. And then, of course, there's a lot of execution that needs to go on to get it to seed stage funding, etc. So that's the first thing, that campaigning. Secondly, is that ability to build a team. If you go back to my point saying there's three things that you could have in founder teams in terms of purpose, in terms of technology, in terms of selling. If you're going to have the first two, then you need to be able to build the rest of the team around you. That might be finance, might be operations, definitely is going to be sales. So their willingness to see that they will need to create a senior team, their ability to build that, because that's slightly different from recruitment in terms of taking on people who are potentially going to be at the board table with you, etc. And embracing that is so crucial to getting through the next stages, and is what Series A funders in particular will want to see as a rounded management team covering all the areas, not all of whom were founders. And I think that the third bit is that really smart on the execution side, knowing when to put cost in, to assess whether you're getting a return on it, to really understand your customer sales cycles, because the two things that can broadly go wrong with all early stage companies is it takes you much longer and more capital than you expected to win customers, and on the other side it costs you a lot more to create the product or service or to deliver it than you ever expected, and those two things eat the funding you raise, cause issues with valuation at a later date. And so the more accurate you can be on that, the better.
Yeah, no, very, very helpful insights. And we have a question from our audience, Stephen, which I'm going to take here, and then we might revert back to some of our themes. But Matthias asks, what do you see as the strengths or must-haves for an effective investment committee for a Tech for Good fund, which is focusing on early stage businesses?
Well, first of all, I think you have to really want to live and breathe it, because that's what helps you kind of work with the executive investing team and the founders that you'll come across. I think the other aspect is clarity around how you build the impact, both in terms of metrics and debate around the things we've been talking about, into the investment discussion and the debate. And I think it was Nat just saying that in financial terms, it's fairly clear what accounting policies are, etc. In terms of measuring impact, there aren't so many standards. But one of the really good things about working with BGV is you've done a lot of that thinking. And not only that, when I joined, you were able to demonstrate many years of consistently following the metrics through from the first incubation investment all the way through to Series A. And that's really important at the investment committee, that you've got that faith in the consistency of the information being presented to you, because you are very much subject to what the team collects from the individual companies and how they present it to you.
And do you think, I guess in particular around those themes, is there anything that you would, based on your experience, advise people that are perhaps new to impact investing in terms of what should their expectations be, I guess particularly for early stage businesses? What do you have any misconceptions when you first kind of explored the role with us that you have been challenged or have changed as a result of seeing what these companies are capable of and when in terms of impact?
I think two things probably. One was I was taken by surprise, but very pleasantly, by the incredible enthusiasm and skills of the leaders of the portfolio companies. You know, that's why we started to meet them. It was a hugely enjoyable experience, and I would say from working in other investment businesses, you don't get that consistency across the portfolio. So it's an absolute pleasure in that sense. On the other side, I think the challenge is, coming back to that impact point and the metrics, is getting right the kind of order of discussion, because impact's important. Success as an enterprise, you know, you are going to be competing for funding and for customers with businesses without that impact, and so therefore you have to measure up in terms of, you know, return on investment when you're either employing extra staff, etc., or investing in capex. So getting that kind of order and blend right is one of the things I think I've found in the debates we've had at the investment committee. You have to be as good as judging management teams and analysing the financials as you are at appreciating the impact. Sure.
And I think there's probably an interesting point to also kind of relate to Matthias's question about what an effective investment committee looks like, which perhaps resonates with some of the points Elin raised earlier about investors, which is around diversity of perspectives. And I think Nat touched on this as well, in terms of you know, having different kind of views around a problem, around a business opportunity, and to really get the best out of that. Is that something that you would advocate for? Are there any particular examples that from perhaps your sort of broader experience that you would say, yes, if I was putting together an investment committee right now, these are the types of things I'd want to talk into? Yeah,
I mean, you're right in that sense, in that I probably, in answering that previous question, took for granted sort of how good the makeup of the BGV team is in terms of bringing that diversity, because there's investment committees I've sat on in more traditional investment businesses where there clearly hasn't been, and there hasn't been any thought about it either. And I think that's probably an interesting contrast for BGV with and for the founders, in terms of tapping into other sources of capital as the businesses grow and go through Series A and Series B, is really, BGV will be a hard investor to measure up against in terms of bringing that diversity of thought. And it is really diversity of thought, I think. So in terms of appreciating where the underlying businesses are in their approach, the challenges they're facing, and the differences they're bringing to the table for investors in terms of delivering on impact and their own diversity and equality policies themselves.
Yeah, ESG is certainly something which is, you know, it's certainly coming into sharper focus for a lot of investors and VCs right now. One of the things I did just want to explore a little further with you, and then it might be our last question, just because we're coming up to time. But one of the things you mentioned was about the need for management teams, founders, when you're thinking about investing into an impactful business, to really have that sort of campaigning mentality, but that broader perspective around, you know, sort of who are their stakeholders, what's the sort of the change that needs to happen in the system in which they're operating in order to enable their business to thrive and for real change to happen. Is there anything you would say that as an investor you are mindful of in terms of either the types of industries where tech for good impact businesses are often operating, any challenges there, and also I guess maybe any experience or things to watch out for in terms of the risk of being too early? You know, is the market ready for the change that founder might want to see in the world?
Definitely, I think, well, a lot of the opportunity is in the health area. You see that within your own portfolio. I personally have invested in and became part-time chairman of a data as a service business into the health service and pharmaceutical industry. And it was one of the toughest rides in terms of getting sales traction, because of the inertia, because of the bureaucracy, because of the lower budgets than say in financial services, etc. So, but if you make sure you raise enough money and you allow for that, and you bring people who've got a strong track record in influencing in that industry, then the upside is that you not only make a real difference financially, but you can make a real difference to the way they go about their practices, and obviously how the impact is measured in that. So I think there's a longer game, and more allowance need to be made in, in particular in the UK, where you've got the NHS. And of course, different countries have very different sort of healthcare setups. So that for me is one that we definitely should be supporting and looking for gains in, but you have to allow for the fact that it can be a much longer game. And maybe that's what puts a number of investors off playing in this earlier stage part of the market, making such a difference. But the upside is definitely there.
Yeah, and I think it's certainly from our perspective, we have a number of companies in the health space, but also in energy, for example. Charlie alluded to some of the sort of sort of dominant forces in agriculture. A lot of these industries are sort of extremely established, some highly regulated. Certainly there are some very large players, and it can be a lot.
And you've got different characteristics there in terms of, say in health, there's an acknowledgement that they want to do things differently. It's just very painful, the process of them actually changing that. In energy and agriculture, you've perhaps got less history of change and transformation. And therefore there's more of that educational process that people have to go through. But whether it's Charlie with agriculture or Elin with health, they're both industries, markets that take very long-term views, and therefore are very evidential in their decision making. So you have to build up evidence and decent sample sizes of information for people to want to trust you and then go wholehearted with you.
Yeah, so credibility definitely key, but also I suppose sort of refers back to your earlier point around the importance of also bringing in people that are experienced in the sales process, particularly where those are long, complicated, bureaucratic, or just very specific to an industry, helpful to be able to leverage that expertise in time as you scale. Fantastic.
Definitely. Sales is, as you said in your introduction, go to market and recruitment sales teams is something I focus on a lot. And it can be challenging to founders, because there feels like there's a shift from a founder-led sale to a sales-led sale. And salespeople can have an interest in the product or service, but ultimately their training is all about stages of process, depending on which methodology they've had. And how they communicate that to the business and how they orchestrate it in the business is really important to them succeeding. And can be disappointing sometimes to founders, because they look and say, well, someone's turning this into a very structured process, when actually I think it's been about passion to date and things like that. And that probably is true with the early adopters in the market. But to get to scale in the mass market, it's going to be about the discipline of creating enough inquiries, of creating enough meetings, creating enough pricing proposals, and then what your conversion rates are on them, which is how salespeople like to be judged.
Yeah, so a really important step change there that a business needs to be able to achieve. Steven, we are just about out of time. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts about investing in impact for us. It's been super useful to hear about some of the do's and don'ts from your experience. Our audience, I think I'm going to hand you over to Chansu just to wrap up and let you know where you can access recordings, etc. So from Steven and I, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Steven. Thank you, Melanie. And thank you, everyone, for being with us today. We are at the end of our event. I do hope you enjoyed the conversations and the insights and found them interesting and, dare I say, useful. As Paul mentioned, there is no shortage of very exciting opportunities in tech for good and impact. And we are always encouraged to see more and more investors joining the wider impact investment ecosystem. The way we tend to work with other investors are either through direct investments / co-investments into our portfolio, or investments into BGV via our SCIS, EIS, or institutional vehicles. So if you would like to have a conversation about whether we might be able to work together, or if you would just like to talk and learn more about BGV, I would be very happy to do so. I'm at johnson@bethnalgreenventures.com. I believe my colleague Millie will be putting my email address in the chat momentarily. And as we mentioned, we recorded the event, and all the attendees will receive the recording in a few days' time. In the meanwhile, I hope everyone has a great week. Thanks all. That's all. Bye.